Hedonism, rooted in the pursuit of pleasure, shapes theories about what's good, how we should act, and what drives us. It highlights pleasure and pain as crucial factors. While some think pleasure and pain are just important, hedonism boldly claims they're the only things that truly matter, making it stand out philosophically. Imagine pleasure is the ultimate currency in life, and pain is its opposite. Hedonists argue that pleasure, whether from a gentle massage or a happy memory, is what we should aim for, while pain, like stubbing a toe or hearing bad news, is what we should avoid. It's an appealing idea, but not everyone agrees. This journey into hedonism explores its origins, its evolution, and the different types of pleasure-focused theories. We'll also delve into the criticisms aimed at these approaches, making for a fascinating exploration of what truly makes life fulfilling. 1. Types of hedonism. A. Folk hedonism. When the term hedonism is used in modern literature, or by non-philosophers in their everyday talk, its meaning is quite different from the meaning it takes when used in the discussions of philosophers. Non-philosophers tend to think of a hedonist as a person who seeks out pleasure for themselves without any particular regard for their own future well-being or for the well-being of others. According to non-philosophers, then, a stereotypical hedonist is someone who never misses an opportunity to indulge of the pleasures of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, even if the indulgences are likely to lead to relationship problems, health problems, regrets, or sadness for themselves or others. Philosophers commonly refer to this everyday understanding of hedonism as folk hedonism. Folk hedonism is a rough combination of motivational hedonism, hedonistic egoism, and a reckless lack of foresight. B. Value hedonism and prudential hedonism. When philosophers discuss hedonism, they are most likely to be referring to hedonism about value, and especially the slightly more specific theory, hedonism about well-being. Hedonism is a theory about value, best referred to as value hedonism, holds that all and only pleasure is intrinsically valuable and all and only pain is intrinsically disvaluable. The term, intrinsically, is an important part of the definition and is best understood in contrast to the term, instrumentally. Something is intrinsically valuable if it is valuable for its own sake. Pleasure is thought to be intrinsically valuable because, even if it did not lead to any other benefit, it would still be good to experience. Money is an example of an instrumental good. Its value for us comes from what we can do with it, what we can buy with it. The fact that a copious amount of money has no value if no one ever sells anything reveals that money lacks intrinsic value. Value hedonism reduces everything of value to pleasure. For example, a value hedonist would explain the instrumental value of money by describing how the things we can buy with money, such as food, shelter, and status-signifying goods, bring us pleasure or help us to avoid pain. Hedonism is a theory about well-being, best referred to as prudential hedonism, is more specific than value hedonism because it stipulates what the value is for. Prudential hedonism holds that all and only pleasure intrinsically makes people's lives go better for them and all and only pain intrinsically makes their lives go worse for them. Some philosophers replace people with animals or sentient creatures, so as to apply prudential hedonism more widely. A good example of this comes from Peter Singer's work on animals and ethics. Singer questions why some humans can see the intrinsic disvalue in human pain, but do not also accept that it is bad for sentient non-human animals to experience pain. When prudential hedonists claim that happiness is what they value most, they intend happiness to be understood as a preponderance of pleasure over pain. An important distinction between prudential hedonism and folk hedonism is that prudential hedonists usually understand that pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain in the very short term is not always the best strategy for achieving the best long-term balance of pleasure over pain. Prudential hedonism is an integral part of several derivative types of hedonistic theory, all of which have featured prominently in philosophical debates of the past. Since prudential hedonism plays this important role, the majority of this article is dedicated to prudential hedonism. First, however, the main derivative types of hedonism are briefly discussed. C. Motivational hedonism. Motivational hedonism, also known as psychological hedonism, posits that our desires for pleasure and aversion to pain govern all of our behavior, including unconscious desires. While weak versions suggest that these desires often influence us, strong versions claim they exclusively guide our actions. Epicurus, William James, Sigmund Freud, Bentham, Mill, and even Darwin have supported various forms of motivational hedonism. Strong versions, however, face skepticism due to examples of actions seemingly motivated by duty rather than pleasure, like self-sacrifice or altruism. Even introspective evidence challenges the idea, as many decisions appear to stem from motives beyond pleasure-seeking. Plato's Ring of Aegas thought experiment, where Socrates debates Glaucon, highlights this debate. Glaucon argues for strong motivational hedonism, while Socrates contends that love of justice can overcome selfish desires. Currently, strong motivational hedonism lacks substantial support due to these challenges, placing the burden of proof on those advocating for its validity. D. Normative hedonism. Value hedonism, occasionally with assistance from motivational hedonism, has been used to argue for specific theories of right action, theories that explain which actions are morally permissible or impermissible and why. The theory that happiness should be pursued, that pleasure should be pursued and pain should be avoided, is referred to as normative hedonism and sometimes ethical hedonism. There are two major types of normative hedonism: hedonistic egoism and hedonistic utilitarianism. Both types commonly use happiness, defined as pleasure minus pain, as the sole criterion for determining the moral rightness or wrongness of an action. Important variations within each of these two main types specify either the actual resulting happiness after the act or the predicted resulting happiness before the act as the moral criterion. Although both major types of normative hedonism have been accused of being repugnant, hedonistic egoism is considered the most offensive. Hedonistic egoism. Hedonistic egoism is a hedonistic version of egoism, the theory that we should, morally speaking, do whatever is most in our own interests. Hedonistic egoism is the theory that we ought, morally speaking, to do whatever makes us happiest, that is, whatever provides us with the most net pleasure after pain is subtracted. The most repugnant feature of this theory is that one never has to ascribe any value whatsoever to the consequences for anyone other than oneself. For example, a hedonistic egoist who did not feel saddened by theft would be morally required to steal, even from needy orphans, if he thought he could get away with it. Would-be defenders of hedonistic egoism often point out that performing acts of theft, murder, treachery and the like would not make them happier overall because of the guilt, the fear of being caught, and the chance of being caught and punished. The would-be defenders tend to surrender, however, when it is pointed out that a hedonistic egoist is morally obliged by their own theory to pursue an unusual kind of practical education, a brief and possibly painful training period that reduces their moral emotions of sympathy and guilt. Such an education might be achieved by desensitizing over exposure to, and performance of, torture on innocents. If hedonistic egoists underwent such an education, their reduced capacity for sympathy and guilt would allow them to take advantage of any opportunities to perform pleasurable, but normally guilt-inducing, actions, such as stealing from the poor. Hedonistic egoism is very unpopular amongst philosophers, not just for this reason, but also because it suffers from all of the objections that apply to prudential hedonism. Hedonistic utilitarianism. Hedonistic utilitarianism is the theory that the right action is the one that produces, or is most likely to produce, the greatest net happiness for all concerned. Hedonistic utilitarianism is often considered fairer than hedonistic egoism because the happiness of everyone involved, everyone who is affected or likely to be affected, is taken into account and given equal weight. Hedonistic utilitarians, then, tend to advocate not stealing from needy orphans because to do so would usually leave the orphan far less happy and the probably better off thief only slightly happier, assuming he felt no guilt. Despite treating all individuals equally, Hedonistic utilitarianism is still seen as objectionable by some because it assigns no intrinsic moral value to justice, friendship, truth, or any of the many other goods that are thought by some to be irreducibly valuable. For example, a hedonistic utilitarian would be morally obliged to publicly execute an innocent friend of theirs if doing so was the only way to promote the greatest happiness overall. Although unlikely, such a situation might arise if a child was murdered in a small town and the lack of suspects was causing large-scale inter-ethnic violence. Some philosophers argue that executing an innocent friend is immoral precisely because it ignores the intrinsic values of justice, friendship, and possibly truth. Hedonistic utilitarianism is rarely endorsed by philosophers, but mainly because of its reliance on prudential hedonism as opposed to its utilitarian element. Non-hedonistic versions of utilitarianism are about as popular as the other leading theories of right action, especially when it is the actions of institutions that are being considered. 2. The origins of hedonism. A. Carvaka. Perhaps the earliest written record of hedonism comes from the Carvaka, an Indian philosophical tradition based on the Bharaspatya Sutras. The Carvaka persisted for 2,000 years, from about 600 BCE. Most notably, the Carvaka advocated skepticism and hedonistic egoism, that the right action is the one that brings the actor the most net pleasure. The Carvaka acknowledged that some pain often accompanied, or was later caused by, sensual pleasure, but that pleasure was worth it. B. Aristippus and the Cyrenaics. The Cyrenaics, founded by Aristippus c. 435 to 356 BCE, were also skeptics and hedonistic egoists. Although the paucity of original texts makes it difficult to confidently state all of the justifications for the Cyrenaics' positions, their overall stance is clear enough. The Cyrenaics believed pleasure was the ultimate good and everyone should pursue all immediate pleasures for themselves. They considered bodily pleasures better than mental pleasures, presumably because they were more vivid or trustworthy. The Cyrenaics also recommended pursuing immediate pleasures and avoiding immediate pains with scant or no regard for future consequences. Their reasoning for this is even less clear, but is most plausibly linked to their skeptical views, perhaps that what we can be most sure of in this uncertain existence is our current bodily pleasures. C. Epicurus. Epicurus c. 341 to 271 BCE, founder of Epicureanism, developed a normative hedonism in stark contrast to that of Aristippus. The Epicureanism of Epicurus is also quite the opposite to the common usage of Epicureanism. While we might like to go on a luxurious, Epicurean, holiday packed with fine dining and moderately excessive whining, Epicurus would warn us that we are only setting ourselves up for future pain. For Epicurus, happiness was the complete absence of bodily and especially mental pains, including fear of the gods and desires for anything other than the bare necessities of life. Even with only the limited excesses of ancient Greece on offer, Epicurus advised his followers to avoid towns, and especially marketplaces, in order to limit the resulting desires for unnecessary things. Once we experience unnecessary pleasures, such as those from sex and rich food, we will then suffer from painful and hard to satisfy desires for more and better of the same. No matter how wealthy we might be, Epicurus would argue, our desires will eventually outstrip our means and interfere with our ability to live tranquil, happy lives. Epicureanism is generally egoistic, in that it encourages everyone to pursue happiness for themselves. However, Epicureans would be unlikely to commit any of the selfish acts we might expect from other egoists because Epicureans train themselves to desire only the very basics, which gives them very little reason to do anything to interfere with the affairs of others. D. The oyster example. With the exception of a brief period discussed below, hedonism has been generally unpopular ever since its ancient beginnings. Although criticisms of the ancient forms of hedonism were many and varied, one in particular was heavily cited. In Philebus, Plato's Socrates and one of his many foils, Protarchus in this instance, are discussing the role of pleasure in the good life. Socrates asks Protarchus to imagine a life without much pleasure but full of the higher cognitive processes, such as knowledge, forethought and consciousness, and to compare it with a life that is the opposite. Socrates describes this opposite life as having perfect pleasure but the mental life of an oyster, pointing out that the subject of such a life would not be able to appreciate any of the pleasure within it. The harrowing thought of living the pleasurable but unthinking life of an oyster causes Protarchus to abandon his hedonistic argument. The oyster example is now easily avoided by clarifying that pleasure is best understood as being a conscious experience, so any sensation that we are not consciously aware of cannot be pleasure. 3. The development of hedonism. A. Bentham. During the peak of empiricism in the 18th and 19th centuries, normative and motivational hedonism gained popularity, notably championed by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Bentham advocated for various forms of hedonism, including prudential hedonism, hedonistic utilitarianism, and motivational hedonism, albeit his commitment to strong motivational hedonism waned over time. Bentham's foundational principle was that happiness, defined as pleasure in the absence of pain, was the ultimate good. He proposed the greatest happiness principle, asserting that actions are morally right if they maximize happiness for all affected individuals. To justify this, he developed the hedonic calculus, a method for measuring pleasure and pain in various actions. This calculus considered aspects like certainty, propinquity, extent, intensity, duration, fecundity, and purity, with only intensity and duration possessing intrinsic value for individuals. Bentham's inclusion of factors like certainty and propinquity distinguishes his hedonism from folk hedonism, which focuses more on immediate pleasure. For Bentham, pleasures were measured objectively against these criteria, regardless of their source. Thus, pleasure from simple activities like push-pin held equal value to that from more refined pursuits like music or poetry, making Bentham's theory a form of quantitative hedonism. Bentham's ideas not only influenced moral philosophy but also informed his advocacy for legal reforms, presenting a utilitarian approach to societal well-being. B. Mill. Bentham's indifferent stance on the source of pleasures led to others disparaging his hedonism as the philosophy of swine. Even his student, John Stuart Mill, questioned whether we should believe that a satisfied pig leads a better life than a dissatisfied human or that a satisfied fool leads a better life than a dissatisfied Socrates, results that Bentham's quantitative hedonism seems to endorse. Like Bentham, Mill endorsed the varieties of hedonism now referred to as prudential hedonism, hedonistic utilitarianism, and motivational hedonism. Mill also thought happiness, defined as pleasure and the avoidance of pain, was the highest good. Where Mill's hedonism differs from Bentham's is in his understanding of the nature of pleasure. Mill argued that pleasures could vary in quality, being either higher or lower pleasures. Mill employed the distinction between higher and lower pleasures in an attempt to avoid the criticism that his hedonism was just another philosophy of swine. Lower pleasures are those associated with the body, which we share with other animals, such as pleasure from quenching thirst or having sex. Higher pleasures are those associated with the mind, which were thought to be unique to humans, such as pleasure from listening to opera, acting virtuously, and philosophizing. Mill justified this distinction by arguing that those who have experienced both types of pleasure realize that higher pleasures are much more valuable. He dismissed challenges to this claim by asserting that those who disagreed lacked either the experience of higher pleasures or the capacity for such experiences. For Mill, higher pleasures were not different from lower pleasures by mere degree, they were different in kind. Since Mill's theory of prudential hedonism focuses on the quality of the pleasure, rather than the amount of it, it is best described as a type of qualitative hedonism. C. Moore. George Edward Moore (1873–1958) was instrumental in bringing hedonism's brief heyday to an end. Moore's criticisms of hedonism in general, and Mill's hedonism in particular, were frequently cited as good reasons to reject hedonism even decades after his death. Indeed, since G. E. Moore, Hedonism has been viewed by most philosophers as being an initially intuitive and interesting family of theories, but also one that is flawed on closer inspection. More was a pluralist about value and argued persuasively against the value hedonist's central claim, that all and only pleasure is the bearer of intrinsic value. More's most damaging objection against hedonism was his heap of filth example. More himself thought the heap of filth example thoroughly refuted what he saw as the only potentially viable form of prudential hedonism, that conscious pleasure is the only thing that positively contributes to well-being. More used the heap of filth example to argue that prudential hedonism is false because pleasure is not the only thing of value. In the heap of filth example, More asks the reader to imagine two worlds, one of which is exceedingly beautiful and the other a disgusting heap of filth. More then instructs the reader to imagine that no one would ever experience either world and asks if it is better for the beautiful world to exist than the filthy one. As More expected, his contemporaries tended to agree that it would be better if the beautiful world existed. Relying on this agreement, More infers that the beautiful world is more valuable than the heap of filth and, therefore, that beauty must be valuable. More then concluded that all of the potentially viable theories of prudential hedonism, those that value only conscious pleasures, must be false because something, namely beauty, is valuable even when no conscious pleasure can be derived from it. More's heap of filth example has rarely been used to object to prudential hedonism since the 1970s because it is not directly relevant to prudential hedonism, it evaluates worlds and not lives. More's other objections to prudential hedonism also went out of favor around the same time. The demise of these arguments was partly due to mounting objections against them, but mainly because arguments more suited to the task of refuting prudential hedonism were developed. These arguments are discussed after the contemporary varieties of hedonism are introduced below. 4. Contemporary varieties of hedonism. A. The main divisions. Contemporary prudential hedonism comes in different flavors, mainly split between quantitative and qualitative camps. Quantitative hedonists focus solely on the amount of pleasure, while qualitative hedonists consider additional dimensions of pleasure quality. Quantitative hedonists often overvalue simple pleasures, while qualitative hedonists argue for nuanced aspects of pleasure beyond just quantity, like moral significance or bodily versus cognitive pleasure. Debates also arise on whether pain outweighs pleasure and whether pleasure is solely internal or includes external elements. Pleasure is commonly defined as sensation, but this poses challenges when considering abstract pleasures like a sense of accomplishment. Some propose an independent pleasure sense to address this. Understanding pleasure as sensation helps distinguish between pleasures from different senses but can lead to oversimplification for quantitative hedonists, while qualitative hedonists can use it to explore nuances in pleasure quality. C. Pleasure as intrinsically valuable experience. Hedonists have also defined pleasure as intrinsically valuable experience, that is to say any experiences that we find intrinsically valuable either are, or include, instances of pleasure. According to this definition, the reason that listening to music and eating a fine meal are both intrinsically pleasurable is because those experiences include an element of pleasure, along with the other elements specific to each activity, such as the experience of the texture of the food and the melody of the music. By itself, this definition enables hedonists to make an argument that is close to perfectly circular. Defining pleasure as intrinsically valuable experience and well-being as all and only experiences that are intrinsically valuable allows a hedonist to all but stipulate that prudential hedonism is the correct theory of well-being. Where defining pleasure as intrinsically valuable experience is not circular is in its stipulation that only experiences matter for well-being. Some well-known objections to this idea are discussed below. Another problem with defining pleasure as intrinsically valuable experience is that the definition does not tell us very much about what pleasure is or how it can be identified. For example, knowing that pleasure is intrinsically valuable experience would not help someone to work out if a particular experience was intrinsically or just instrumentally valuable. Hedonists have attempted to respond to this problem by explaining how to find out whether an experience is intrinsically valuable. One method is to ask yourself if you would like the experience to continue for its own sake, rather than because of what it might lead to. Wanting an experience to continue for its own sake reveals that you find it to be intrinsically valuable. While still making a coherent theory of well-being, defining intrinsically valuable experiences as those you want to perpetuate makes the theory much less hedonistic. The fact that what a person wants is the main criterion for something having intrinsic value makes this kind of theory more in line with preference satisfaction theories of well-being. The central claim of preference satisfaction theories of well-being is that some variant of getting what one wants, or should want, under certain conditions is the only thing that intrinsically improves one's well-being. Another method of fleshing out the definition of pleasure as intrinsically valuable experience is to describe how intrinsically valuable experiences feel. This method remains a hedonistic one, but seems to fall back into defining pleasure as a sensation. It has also been argued that what makes an experience intrinsically valuable is that you like or enjoy it for its own sake. Hedonists arguing for this definition of pleasure usually take pains to position their definition in between the realms of sensation and preference satisfaction. They argue that since we can like or enjoy some experiences without concurrently wanting them or feeling any particular sensation, then liking is distinct from both sensation and preference satisfaction. Liking and enjoyment are also difficult terms to define in more detail, but they are certainly easier to recognize than the rather opaque, intrinsically valuable experience. Merely defining pleasure as intrinsically valuable experience and intrinsically valuable experiences as those that we like or enjoy still lacks enough detail to be very useful for contemplating well-being. A potential method for making this theory more useful would be to draw on the cognitive sciences to investigate if there is a specific neurological function for liking or enjoying. Cognitive science has not reached the point where anything definitive can be said about this, but a few neuroscientists have experimental evidence that liking and wanting, at least in regards to food, are neurologically distinct processes in rats and have argued that it should be the same for humans. The same scientists have wondered if the same processes govern all of our liking and wanting, but this question remains unresolved. Most hedonists who describe pleasure as intrinsically valuable experience believe that pleasure is internal and conscious. Hedonists who define pleasure in this way may be either quantitative or qualitative hedonists, depending on whether they think that quality is a relevant dimension of how intrinsically valuable we find certain experiences. D. Pleasure as pro-attitude. One of the most recent developments in modern hedonism is the rise of defining pleasure as a pro-attitude, a positive psychological stance toward some object. Any account of prudential hedonism that defines pleasure as a pro-attitude is referred to as attitudinal hedonism because it is a person's attitude that dictates whether anything has intrinsic value. Positive psychological stances include approving of something, thinking it is good, and being pleased about it. The object of the positive psychological stance could be a physical object, such as a painting one is observing, but it could also be a thought, such as, "My country is not at war," or even a sensation. An example of a pro-attitude towards a sensation could be being pleased about the fact that an ice cream tastes so delicious. Fred Feldman, the leading proponent of attitudinal hedonism, argues that the sensation of pleasure only has instrumental value. It only brings about value if you also have a positive psychological stance toward that sensation. In addition to his basic intrinsic attitudinal hedonism, which is a form of quantitative hedonism, Feldman has also developed many variants that are types of qualitative hedonism. For example, desert-adjusted intrinsic attitudinal hedonism, which reduces the intrinsic value a pro-attitude has for our well-being based on the quality of deservedness, that is, on the extent to which the particular object deserves a pro-attitude or not. For example, desert-adjusted intrinsic attitudinal hedonism might stipulate that sensations of pleasure arising from adulterous behavior do not deserve approval, and so assign them no value. Defining pleasure as a pro-attitude, while maintaining that all sensations of pleasure have no intrinsic value, makes attitudinal hedonism less obviously hedonistic as the versions that define pleasure as a sensation. Indeed, defining pleasure as a pro-attitude runs the risk of creating a preference satisfaction account of well-being because being pleased about something without feeling any pleasure seems hard to distinguish from having a preference for that thing. 5. Contemporary objections. A. Pleasure is not the only source of intrinsic value. The primary critique against prudential hedonism is that pleasure alone doesn't determine our well-being. Other factors such as reality, meaning in life, achievements, friendships, and adherence to moral or religious principles also play intrinsic roles. While hedonists argue that these aspects can be explained in terms of pleasure, critics challenge this reductionist view. One widely discussed argument against prudential hedonism is Robert Nozick's experience machine thought experiment. He proposes a machine that provides unparalleled pleasure but disconnects us from reality. Most people intuitively reject this option, indicating that living in reality is crucial for our well-being, suggesting that pleasure isn't the sole determinant of value. Attempts to refute this argument often fall short in persuading non-hedonists. A more promising defense for prudential hedonism lies in highlighting psychological biases, such as the status quo bias, which influence our choices. For instance, when faced with the choice of staying in a simulated reality or going to an unknown reality, most people opt to stay in the familiar setting, indicating that familiarity matters more than reality. Regardless of these attempts at defense, the broader argument, that living in reality contributes significantly to well-being, remains a challenge for hedonists. While there's no definitive method for discerning what truly matters for our well-being, considerations beyond pleasure, like genuine experiences and real consequences, seem to hold sway for many. As such, the debate continues, with no clear resolution in sight. B. Some pleasure is not valuable. One major criticism against prudential hedonism is that not all pleasure contributes equally to well-being. Some pleasures, like base or perverse ones, may be considered less valuable. Qualitative hedonists address this by acknowledging the differing qualities of pleasures and assigning value accordingly. For example, pleasure from sadistic acts is recognized as containing the quality of sadism and thus may be deemed less valuable. Quantitative hedonists, on the other hand, argue that moral or cultural values don't necessarily affect well-being. They maintain that if someone derives pleasure from certain activities, regardless of societal judgments, it contributes positively to their well-being. However, modern criticisms present challenges by highlighting pleasures with a disvaluable aspect that is never experienced by the individual. One such example is Shelley Kagan's deceived businessman thought experiment, where a person experiences pleasure based on false beliefs about how others perceive them. Despite the equal amount of pleasure in both scenarios, most people intuitively consider the deceived businessman to have a worse life. This poses a problem for prudential hedonists, as the quantitatively equal pleasure doesn't equate to equal well-being. Qualitative hedonism struggles to address this as well, since the disvaluable aspect of pleasure is never consciously experienced. While prudential hedonists may argue for the equal value of both lives, these modern criticisms challenge the core principles of hedonism, making it difficult to gain widespread acceptance. C. There is no coherent and unifying definition of pleasure. Critics of prudential hedonism argue that defining pleasure in a meaningful way poses a major challenge. Pleasures vary greatly, from reading a book to bungee jumping to having sex, making it tough to find a single definition that fits them all. Quantitative hedonism, which aims to measure pleasure, struggles to compare these diverse experiences, hindering its practical use. Attempts to unify pleasures often fall short, either by reducing pleasure to a simple sensation, which doesn't match our introspection, or by defining it as liking or pro-attitudes, which strays from common understanding. Qualitative hedonism fares better by evaluating pleasures based on their distinct qualities, but still faces the challenge of comparing them effectively. Furthermore, Adjusting definitions to overcome objections risks making pleasure unrecognizable from our everyday understanding, diluting its intuitive value for well-being. In essence, defining pleasure in a way that satisfies both philosophical rigor and intuitive understanding remains a formidable task for hedonists. 6. The future of hedonism. The future of hedonism faces challenges, with strong arguments against its core principle. Despite creative redefinitions of pleasure, hedonists often find themselves defending theories that lack realism. Yet, there's hope in cognitive science. As we understand pleasure better and uncover biases in our thinking, hedonism might see a comeback. Some emerging findings even support aspects of hedonism, offering a glimmer of hope for its revival.